Hi, my name is Marshall Tessler. I'm a graphic designer. I've been attending Riverwood Church for about a year and a half now. I go to the 11:15 service on Sundays. I was brought up in a Jewish household, and I've always been taught how to pray, how to speak. There's a lot of rules in the Judaism, and I always felt it was very dogmatic and step by step, and if you don't do it right, you don't have that relationship with God. And I was always just feeling I was going through the motions, doing what I was told to do, doing it where I was supposed to be doing it. And now, as a Christ follower, I can just talk to God anytime I want, whenever I want. I can listen to Him. I don't need permission. There's no wrong way to do it. When I started reading a chapter a day, and it all started coming together for me, and I realized who Christ really was, that's when I slowly was turning my life over to Christ. By the time I got to the end of John, I knew baptism was in my future. I mean, getting baptized it transformed me in a way that other people can see. I mean, it did a change on the inside. I already had that change when I was there, about to get dunked into the water. But when I came up and I saw everybody smiling and cheering, I felt that they were feeling what I was feeling on the outside. And if I think about it, I can go right there in my head, and I love it. My life is not easier just because I got baptized. I see things through Christ's eyes now. I approach things differently. There are still turmoil. Right now, my wife is in the hospital. She's been in the hospital for over 40 days, and I've gotten unbelievable support from the church community, more than I ever got from any community I had before, more from my own flesh and blood family. I am getting meal train. I am getting prayer groups. I'm getting phone calls and support. People are going to go visiting her. Their friends from the church are seeing my wife in the hospital more than I'm getting a chance to, which warms my heart so much. I feel like this church community is truly my family, and I appreciate it all, and I see it's all God's work doing it, because without the community, without the people in it, I'd feel all alone. I mean, I'm not the first person to say, God is great, why do bad things happen? I'm not expected to understand. I have an earth brain, I'm an earth body. God is supernatural, God is the all-powerful creator. He has His reasons. I can question them, but I do not have to understand them. What I do have to do is accept them, because I don't have control, He has control. In the glory of all the good that could happen in one's life, or the crashes of everything falling down around me in turmoil, I will use God as my shield. My chapter a day experience begins either first thing in the morning or right before I go to sleep. And I read through it, and then I pause, or Selah, and I think to myself, how does this apply to me? Does it apply to me? Rhema is something that I experience when I'm reading in the Bible, and I think that those words are right for me right now in this moment at the time. I mean, I could read 3 lines, and there'd be one in there that jumps out, grabs me by the heart or by the throat and says, this is what you should do, or this is what you should have done. But just the experience in reading the Psalm 37, when it says about the anger, I was very angry about something very stupid moments before sitting down. I said, I'm going to read this now. I'm going to calm myself. I'm going to get close to God. I'm going to relax. I start reading. I'm like, okay, good. And then all of a sudden I get right to the part about, don't get angry. Watch your rage. And I had to put the book down. I started to cry, because that was God talking right to me. The words could have jumped up and danced off the page into my heart, because that's exactly what happened. I call that being God smacked. I was just, a smack can be like a good boy, or it can be like, you should know better. And sometimes it's one or sometimes it's the other. But I experienced that. I know that is God talking to me. But no matter what, there's a message in there for me. I know there is, and there's one for you.
Well, thank you, Marshall, and welcome to everybody at the warehouse and the fire hall up in Churchill, watching online. We are on our journey of reading through the Bible in 1,000 days, and we've come to the book of Psalms. And so for this month, we want to start a new series called No Matter What. And today, we're going to do Persevere No Matter What. And I've chosen Psalm 34 from one of the Psalms that we've read this week as a guide to us in our discussion today. The Psalms were written by a variety of people, and they were written for different reasons. Some of them were written as personal journals. Some of those journals got made into songbooks and they became the lyrics for songs. Others were just doing it as some of their teaching stuff. And the Psalm 34 that we're going to look at today was written by David when he was about 20 years old. So he was a very young man, just beginning to walk with God in a deeper, more mature way. He also wrote at this time Psalm 56. But what you need to understand about those two Psalms is that they were written after the worst failure of David's life up until this point in time. They were written at the lowest point of his life up until this time. It was the first time that David walked through really dark valley. And so out of that, he wrote these Psalms. Now, what makes me say that is that both Psalm 34 and 56 have a title at the beginning of the Psalms. Whenever you see a title at the beginning of the Psalms, it's saying, pay attention to this title because it tells you the time and circumstances when this psalm was written. So if you want to get the greatest impact from this psalm, understand the circumstances behind it. So Psalm 34 says this, a psalm of David regarding the time he pretended to be insane in front of Abimelech who sent him away. And then Psalm 56 says, a psalm of David regarding the time the Philistines seized him in Gath. So what I do is, okay, where did that happen in David's life? Is there something in the Bible about David being in Gath with the Philistines and acting insane? And sure enough, there is. In 1 Samuel 21, it says, so David escaped from Saul and went to King Achish or Abimelech of Gath. So now I know the historical time when this psalm took place. And so what happened before chapter 21? What happened in chapter 20 and 19 and 18? So let me take you through that and build into these Psalms. If you've been to Sunday school, you're very familiar with a lot of what I'm going to say now because it's part of Sunday school stories. But David, as a teenage boy, was anointed to be the next king of Israel. King Saul, the first king, was ruling, but he was going downhill fast. He was not ruling well. He was more concerned about hanging on to his power than about caring for the people under him. And so Samuel the prophet secretly went and anointed David to be the next king of Israel. He was to be God's chosen leader, and he became Israel's greatest king. After that, David went and took care of his sheep. And one day his dad said, go check on your brothers. Your brothers are in a war with the neighboring country, the Philistines. Take them some food and see how they're doing. So David goes to check up on his brothers. And when he gets there, there's this huge giant yelling out. His name is Goliath, and he is saying, I'm from the Philistines, and instead of having our two armies meet where there'll be a lot of death, you picked your best soldier and come and fight me, and we'll let this happen, just two soldiers fighting it out. And whoever wins, they're going to win the battle. And all of Israel's soldiers are cowering in fear. And David, as a teenage boy, is confused and is going, why is nobody fighting this guy? He's despising God. He is laughing in God's face. I will fight him if nobody else will. And everybody was saying, well, we're sure to lose. But they had no other option. And so David, with his slingshot and 5 stones, went and defeated Goliath. That event launched David into the public eye. He became the most well-known person in Israel. They even wrote a song about them, and it was sang everywhere, Saul has killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. And so what was happening in David's life all of a sudden is the trajectory of his life was going upwards fast. He was headed to become the king. He was popular. He has shown himself to be a warrior who is brave, a man of God, and everything was looking wonderful for King David. That takes us to chapter 20, because all that was about to change. David was about to be blindsided by something that would rock his world. King Saul, who he looked to as a surrogate father, King Saul, who he had played the harp for when King Saul was agitated, King Saul, who had invited him to eat with his family, and King Saul's son Jonathan had become David's best friend, now has sent soldiers to kill him. And David did not see that coming. How could this man who he loved, this man he respected and saw as a surrogate father, all of a sudden turn on him and send soldiers to kill him? And what happens on that evening is David's faith gets rocked, and fear trumps faith. He loses sight of God. He loses sight of God's promise that David will be king, and that Saul won't be able to kill him no matter how hard he tries, because God has made a promise David will be king. He loses sight of all of that. He loses sight of God's faithfulness through Israel's history, and fear and panic take over. And all David can think of is, I got to get out of here. Where can I go where I can escape Saul? And so he starts to weigh out options from this place of fear in his mind. And he says, well, I can't go hide out with family. That would be the first place Saul looks. I can't hide out with friends because Saul knows all my friends and he'll look there too. You know what? If he's got soldiers involved, he's going to have people looking for me everywhere. And I'm going to go from being the most popular man in Israel to be the most wanted man in Israel. I have to leave the country. So where do I go? What other country? Well, the closest country is the Philistine country, Philistia. I'll go there and maybe I can hide out because Saul won't look there because we've been at war with the Philistines. So let's go there. And so, but before he could go there, he's got to pick up a couple provisions. So on his way to Philistia, there's a little kind of church that had a priest there by the name of Abimelech. And David goes in and says, could I get some food? And Abimelech says, David, I don't have any food for you. There's the sacred bread. Why do you need it? And David, out of his fear, starts telling lies to Ahimelech. And Ahimelech knows something's not right. He can tell David's not giving him the truth. And he probes a little bit. David, what's going on? And David tells more lies and more lies. And so when faith is trumped by fear, we begin lying to the people closest to us. David was lying to his pastor about what was going on. And then he said, I also need a weapon, and I forgot to bring my weapon. And Ahimelech's going, what soldier forgets to bring their weapon? And just not adding up. He says, well, I only have one weapon around here, and that's the sword that you took from Goliath when you killed him. It's been here on display of God's power. David says, that's a good idea. Now, he didn't hear about God's power. That didn't register. He just says, give me that sword. Now think about that. David now is going to walk into Philistine territory, to the capital city Gath, with Goliath's sword, who was a Philistine, on his person. Wouldn't that raise alarm bells? So David would all of a sudden go from being the most wanted man in Israel to the guy that's carrying Goliath's sword, who killed Goliath, and now is in Philistia. He is going to be the most wanted man in Philistia. And so here's what happens. David escaped from Saul and went to King Achish of Gath. But the officers of Achish were unhappy about his being there. Isn't this David, the king of the land, they asked? Isn't he the one the people honor with dances, singing? Saul's killed his thousands and David his 10,000s. David overheard these comments and was very afraid what King Achish of Gath might do to him. So he pretended to be insane. scratching on the doors, drooling down his beard. And in that culture, a man's beard was a sign of dignity. And so to drool on your beard was really a great indignity. It was shaming yourself. And so for David to purposely drool on his beard, the only explanation people would be able to give to him is he's got to be insane. Nobody who's sane would drool all over their beard. So David is acting out this part of an insane man. And I love what King Acre says. He says, "Must you bring me a madman? We already have enough of them around here. Why should I let somebody like this be my guest?" In other words, get rid of him. And so David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam, which was just inside of Israel's border in the desert territory. That's where he got into a cave and reconnected with God and wrote this song. And at that time, he confessed his fear to God. He trusted God again. He surrendered to God again. He felt the relationship restored with God. And here's what he writes: "I will praise the Lord at all times. I will constantly speak his praises. I will boast only in the Lord. Let all who are helpless take heart. Come, let us tell of the Lord's greatness. Let us exalt his name together. I prayed to the Lord, and he answered me. He freed me from all my fears. Those who look to him for help will be radiant with joy. No shadow of shame will darken their faces. In my desperation, I prayed, and the Lord listened. He saved me from all my troubles." And then in Psalm 56, he says, "O God, have mercy on me. The enemy troops press in on me. My foes attack me all day long. When I'm afraid, I put my trust in you. O God, I praise your word. I trust in God. So why should I be afraid? What can mere mortals do to me? On the very day I call to you for help, my enemies will retreat. This I know, God is on my side." Faith is back in the driver's seat again. David has a fresh picture of God's faithfulness and power again. Now, I think David, as he wrote this in his journal, said, okay, I'll put this away. Maybe I'll look at it when my kids are older or when my kids get here. Maybe I'll look at it and just be reminded of some things. I don't think David realized how important this psalm was going to become. Because this psalm was not just going to be about what had just happened. What we're now going to see is this psalm became the thing that sustained him for the next 10 years. I think David might have thought, okay, God, you got me out of that jam. Saul didn't get me. I believe he's not going to get me. Saul is the problem here. Would you please deal with Saul? Either get rid of him and let me be a king, or change his mind so that I can live in peace. And then I'll just go on with my life, and that upward trajectory again will be in place and life will be great. You want to know what happened over the next 10 years? Saul, God did not deal with. And Saul chased David with Saul's army of soldiers all around that desert for 10 years. David did not have any rest from being hunted. He was a fugitive, a wanted fugitive, and for 10 years he tried to remain in hiding so that Saul could not catch him. Can you imagine how difficult that would be? God, you've made me, you've told me I'm going to be the king. You anointed me. What's the point of 10 years running around in a desert? Isn't this a waste of time? Isn't this kind of stupid? Why don't you just deal with Saul and get on with me being a king? Whatever could be the purpose of me hiding out in caves for 10 years? I want to give you something. God was using that 10 years to prepare David to be a king. And what was David going to need to be a good king? He was going to need a skill set, a very unique skill set of leading people, of administration, of all kinds of different pieces if he was going to be a king. But more than that, he was going to need people around him that he could rely on, people who would support him, people who would have their own skill sets that he could use to build a kingdom. And he was going to need a close relationship with God. He was going to have a faith that deepened in its trust of God. He was going to have character that deepened to become more like God. Think of it this way. We live in a time when we go to prepare for a job, we go to college or university or Bible school, and that's what we think of in our culture as how we prepare for the job. Do you want to know what God is saying to David? David, schools are great, books are great, but there's a part of the task I have for you that you could never learn in a school or by reading a textbook. There's going to be a university course that nobody else can offer, and it's going to be called God's University. Now, I'll tell you up front, David, you're not going to like it, because my university is going to be nothing but hardship and stress. My university is taking a lump of coal, subjecting it to immense stress and pressure, and creating a diamond. I'm going to transform you, not by textbooks, not by an easy life. I'm going to transform you by putting you through 10 years of constant stress and difficulty. Now, I think David at that point is saying, okay, God, bring it on. And so God says, okay, David, I didn't tell you one part. David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam when his brothers and father's household, and that would include their wives and their children, and they would have been in danger too because Saul would have gone after them. So when they heard about where David was, they went down to the cave of Adullam to be with him. But then all those who were in distress or in debt or discontented gathered around him. In other words, everybody that Saul had hurt, everybody that Saul had exacted unfair taxes from, and they were in debt. Everybody who lived under his oppression and brutality, they were fleeing Saul too. And so they came down to the cave of Adullam and said, David, please be our commander, our leader. About 400 men were with him, and that would include their wives and their children. And then later we're told that 200 more men came. So guess what? At this cave at Adullam, David now has about 2,000 people showing up. And God says, this is going to be part of your university course. Get along with these people and lead these people. Now, I want you to think about that because I don't think David was really excited about that. In fact, I think he was kind of annoyed. And I think he kind of questioned God's wisdom and whether this was really a loving act on God's part. Number one, why I don't think he was too excited. David had just failed God, the worst he had ever failed him in his life. You want to know what happens after you fail? You don't feel qualified to lead. You don't feel qualified to serve. You feel that you're just not in a good place. And you want to know what I think God is showing David? That sometimes your greatest service comes out of your greatest brokenness. That's when you're most dependent and surrendered to me. So David, you're actually at the prime place to become the leader that I need you to be. But secondly, David now had 2,000 people that he had to hide in caves to keep safe. It was no longer just him going around the desert from cave to cave. He now had to have 2,000 people hidden. Now that to me just boggles my mind. And if you think about that, he would have to have little babies that were part of that, little children. And little children and babies don't do well at being quiet all day and still all day. They want to play. They got energy. And David's got to try to keep everybody quiet and hidden. Now, that would be really annoying. If God was to say, keep these people safe while you're running for your lives from the king of Israel. But then, all these people had to be fed. But we're in a desert. You don't grow crops in a desert. You don't have McDonald's in a desert. And all these people are coming to David saying, David, what's for supper? And David's going, God, it's one thing to just feed myself. Now I got to provide food for 2,000 people. God, this is so stressful. Couldn't you find somebody else to do this job? I don't like this stress right now. And it would be overwhelming, I think, to every day go, okay, God, how are we going to feed everybody today? And how are we going to keep everybody hidden today? And then, how about privacy? You just don't get a lot of privacy when you're living in caves with 2,000 people. How do you go to the bathroom with 2,000 onlookers? How do you do all of that? Now, I'm a kind of guy that I have a big bubble. So I don't like people in my bubble a whole lot. And so my wife has a real little bubble. So when we sit down on the couch, I want her at one end of the couch, so I got most of the couch as my bubble. And once in a while, she wants to flop her foot on my leg and invade my bubble. And I've learned as a husband, I've got to let her do that. And some days it really annoys me, but I got to just zip it. And this is our bonding time kind of thing. So I don't know how I would do in a cave where I have a big bubble and I got 2,000 people around. Because there'd be some days when my bubble would be like 3 caves over. Don't come into my space. And where do you go to get a bit of peace and quiet, to have a sober thought about your life and to think and plan? So David was with constant commotion. And some of you who are parents of young children know what it is to have them under feet all day, wanting stuff and talking and fighting each other. You just don't get any peace and quiet. And so David was being asked to live with a family of 2,000 people in very close quarters. Imagine how stressful and hard those 10 years were. Do you know what I think I would have done after 1 year? Okay, God, when's this going to be done? Because I'm done. I can't take another day of putting up with all this nonsense. Do you realize what would have happened too? Who were the people that came? They were people who had been hurt by Saul. They were people who were bitter. They were people who were angry. They were people who were full of resentment. Guess what those kind of people do when they get together and talk? They don't cheer each other up. They just say, here's a platform for me to tell you how bad my life is, and they feed each other's bitterness, and the morale would get worse and worse because everybody's talking about how much they hate King Saul. And David had to listen to that and put up with that. And you go, okay, God, why? Why are you allowing this to happen in my life? Isn't there a course I can take at a university where I get all these skills? And God says, David, hang in there. So here's what he had to learn. David had to learn the struggles of the very people that he would be ruling one day. And as he listened to these people talk, he was taking notes about what not to do as a king. The stuff that King Saul had done to hurt these people so badly, he was saying, okay, note to self, never do that. And that was an important thing for him. But he was also learning, how do you manage all of these grumbling, complaining, negative, critical, bitter people? I think at first, he would have tolerated them. But do you realize what happens when you work with those kind of people? and you're able to form a family with them, and you let them talk, not so that they can just feed their pain, but so they can start to heal, you begin to love those broken people. You begin to go, wow, they have qualities I've never seen in anybody else. And so David was being trained not just to love people who were the positive people, the people who had everything going for them. He was learning, if you're going to be a good king, you got to love everybody that you're serving. And that includes the broken, hurting, negative people. And what a perfect training ground for that. And then he was learning how to be a leader. He had to train these 600 men to be soldiers. He had to have an administrative skill set that was amazing to make sure everybody got fed, to make sure everything went okay, to make sure each person was assigned to take care of little details within the 2,000 people. He was learning how to lead. But as David watched other people heal, his own heart was healing as well. And he was beginning to heal. Because what had happened with King Saul, that was the greatest wound he had ever gone through in his life this far. And now that was starting to heal. But then he was also learning to trust God's timing. Do you know what we would have done in the first year or two? We would have prayed every day to try and change God's timing to suit ours. But David would have come to a point where he said, okay, God, I don't understand why this keeps dragging on, but I got to accept that this comes from a loving heart from you and a wise mind, and I'm going to stop asking you to end it, and I'm just going to trust you to end it when you know the diamond is coming out of that coal. And that was important. But then he was learning to love. Do you realize what would have happened after he got wounded by Saul? He would have wanted to close his heart because he'd been hurt so badly. And it would have been easy to say, God, I'm never going to open my heart to anybody again because I don't want to get hurt by letting people in and then having them hurt me. And God says, you can't lead that way, David. Keep opening your heart. And David was becoming a leader who served with an open heart that had been broken. He was learning forgiveness, and he was learning to trust God. That's why I think Psalm 34 became David's companion through those 10 years. Because every time he was in a new difficult day, when his faith was struggling, he'd go back to his journal to Psalm 34, and he says, God, you delivered me from Gath and from Saul. Would you please do it again? Would you do it again just like you did it then? And Psalm 34 became the sustaining journal through those 10 difficult years. I'm going to release the worship sites. The worship teams are going to sing a song called Do It Again. And it starts with the Israelites walking around the walls of Jericho saying, God, fulfill your promises again.